Yes, it's tink time. Yes, this is not your average video. No, there's some other geezers involved. Yes, none other than David Molesworth. Yeah, we are comparing. We're actually going to be doing a couple of these episodes, and the first one is going to be the Renault 5 Turbo 2. Fantastic little car that was actually developed to take on the Lancia Stratos. So we're going to be comparing that to the Lister Bell Stratos. And after that, we're going to be looking at the Integrale, which of course was Lancia's answer to everything after the 037, which whipped the Audi's ass. So hats off again to Lancia. And the thing about these episodes is that both of us have enjoyed driving all of the vehicles. Yes, David let me drive his Renault 5 Turbo 2, which is a fantastic little car, I have to say. The turbo lag is chronic, but yay, it was early days. And yes, he's driven the Stratos, and yes, I've driven his Integrale, which is an Evo 1, and when I was back in the UK, I had an Evo 2, which is, you know, for the rally purists is not so cool, but from the evolution point of view, obviously it's a little bit better. David. So Renault's answer to the Stratos was to take their compact Renault 5 and modify it somewhat radically, to be honest. Yes, not simply tweaking the motor, adding some flared wheel arches and beefing up the suspension a little, although they did all that too. I mean, as far as flared wheel arches go, you can't get much more ridiculous than these ones.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, just like that.
Oh, here he is, Captain Slowsworth himself, and yeah, he's slightly shorter than me, as you can tell.
Why am I always in the shadow?
Because you're slower than me. Renault decided to go a step further and take the front wheel drive, front engine car, put the engine in the back and make it rear wheel drive, and then slap a turbocharger on just for good measure. Around about the same time, they were doing the same thing in Formula 1.
So actually it's mid-engine, not wheel drive. So it's the engine's there, then the gearbox is behind it, and then they had to widen the car to be able to fit the engine in and the gearbox. And then there's all other kind of modifications to the cooling. Radiator's still in the front, all the cooling tubes come to the rear, and then there's lots of cooling on the side of the car to get air into the intercooler, because it's one of the first cars actually with an intercooler and a turbo on. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, and a lot of engineering, which is really surprising, because you'd think that they just threw this together to go racing.
Anyway, unlike the Stratos, the homologated version was rather civilised in comparison, and sold in big numbers, to the point where they actually did a second edition, over 2,000, I believe. It had a stereo and even electric windows.
Okay. So actually, they produced more than 2,000. So there's two versions: a turbo, which is now known as a Turbo 1, and a Turbo 2. So the Turbo 1, they actually produced over 1,000 cars, which is amazing considering like the Stratos, where they had to build 400 for homologation. Same for the Renault 5 Turbo 1. They couldn't sell them. It took them, I think, 3 or 4 years to sell all the Stratoses. And then with the Renault 5 Turbo 1, they sold more than the homologation number of 400, up to over 1,000. So then after that, they weren't making any money. So each of those cars, it was just like a Veyron, where they, in effect, attach a check to each car. They decided they needed to make the car cheaper so that they could actually make some money out of it. That's where the Turbo 2 came along, where basically they changed the interior. The interior in the Turbo 1 is bizarre, very French, very modern art.
Isn't it just?
Turbo 2 is just the standard interior from a normal Renault Gordini.
Yep.
So the Turbo 2, at the end of the day, they produced just over 3,000. And the final run of that, they produced another 200 cars, which were in effect the Evolution cars, which took them into Group B. And they obviously sold out of those pretty quickly. A lot of those actually came to the USA. So if you see one in the USA, it's normally what they call an 8221 car, which is the Group V version, which turned into the Maxi version you'll see on the Tour de Course, which actually won that event outright in, I think it was 1986.
My driving experience of Renault 5s in all shapes and forms is fairly extensive and sometimes expensive.
And Dell and Crawley number 16.
Yes, I used to race Renault 5 TS in the mid-80s with this motley crew.
In his first season with
Always exciting. And at the same time, my road car was the Renault 5 GT Turbo, front engined turbo, 1400cc. A lot of fun, especially with a turbo kit on it like I had. Destroyed the turbo in 6 months, but boy did it shift.
Thankfully, the turbo handles a lot better than that. In fact, back in the day, when they tested it, it used to get 1G of lateral grip, which was just phenomenal for the day. Just really amazing kind of level of grip. And that's all down to that design where the engine is, mid-engine, those rear wheels, which are so super wide for the day. It was just fantastic.
That actually is phenomenal, because my Corvette C6 from 2005, it was an early one, had a G meter in it, and it was as much as I could do to get it to go past 1G. That's 20 years later.
Shouldn't have bought a Corvette.
Agreed, but yeah.
You were young and needed the money. You're impressionable.
Be fair, we've got a lot of Americans watching. They like their Corvettes, and so do I. We are here to talk about the marvellous Turbo 2. Phenomenal little car to drive, have to say. Just like the Stratos, the turn-in is superb. It's absolutely glued to the road. There's no body roll whatsoever, as you can see in the film. Very, very planted indeed. Almost go-kart-like handling. But at the same time, very civilised to drive on a long-distance journey, with its quite comfortable and will cruise all day at 75 miles an hour. If you're after a more exciting drive, then you do have to keep that motor revving high. As I said before, the turbo lag on it is hideous at low revs. It was early days for turbos, but as long as you keep it buzzing around the 3,500 mark, the turbo is there, and it's very quick. But all in all, a thoroughly wonderful little car, typically quirky, as one expects from Renault. We've just been looking at dimensions and stuff like that. Interesting stuff. Stratos is 2 inches longer. Yes.
Size isn't important.
And despite the fact that the Renault looks like the fat boy, he ain't. There's a couple of pounds in it, 20 pounds at the most.
Well, you shouldn't read a book by the cover, because in fact the Renault was lighter. I think it was like 21.38. That was kind of the poundage of that, and I think the Fat Boy Stratos was actually 25 pounds lighter. And the dogs even agree with me. You can hear them barking in the background.
Given the backside of the Renault looking overly large, both cars are actually 69 inches wide. Exactly the same.
So the Stratos wheelbase is 86 inches versus the Renault 5, which is 95 inches.
96.
Ah, typical. Never good with numbers. It seems to be in the wheelbase. And I think that where that really shows up is that the Stratos was designed, both of them was obviously designed for rallying, on twisty, nimble, that kind of thing. So the shorter the wheelbase, the more twitchy it is, the more ability it is to turn into corners. But I think what they probably found out with the Stratos, it was so extreme that when they developed the Renault, they decided to expand it so that it gained a little bit more stability in the high-speed corners. Still some of that agility, not quite as much as the Stratos, but on the longer, more open corners, it probably handled a little bit better.
Sadly, it didn't see much success in rallying overall, but nevertheless, a fine contender. Yes, indeed, a fine piece of crazy engineering, and we like crazy. One of the things that we forgot to mention was the tail-happy kind of side of both of these cars. I never drove David's Renault to a point where I was pushing it that hard that the rear end would get away from me, and apparently David's never had his rear end out in public either. So I think that just leaves the only other thing to mention at this particular point in time is one of the fundamental differences between these two particular cars right now, given that David's is for sale, is that his works and my Stratos doesn't. If you like this car in particular, I'm talking about David's, it's your lucky day. It's quite an exceptional car, so bid up on Bring a Trailer. And on that note, I think we'll call it a day. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, subscribe down here somewhere and encourage others to watch my lunacy.